Hello, my name's Mono-Logues, and this is Mono-Logues. Today I'll be reading you a short story, presented in 2 parts, called Endless Summer. I really hope you enjoy it. Before I start, I'd like to open with a quote from Benito Cereno by Herman Melville. Yes, this is a strange craft, a strange history too, and strange folks on board, but nothing more. Part 1. I saw disaster looming the whole flight. Sweating alone in departures, I eyeballed my fellow passengers, wondering which of them might smuggle a bomb on board in their suitcase, or stab the pilot with a switchblade mid-flight. I'd brought a book with me, another slim, autobiographical doodle by a bright young thing, but I couldn't read it, could barely make it through a sentence before my eyes trailed off. Finally my group was called, and I joined the back of the long line, boarding pass clasped in my sweaty hand. I had a window seat and gripped my knees through the safety announcements. The man on my left had Netflix up on his iPad, and I watched him hover a finger over a documentary about Osama bin Laden, before thankfully choosing a show called The Murderer Next Door instead. Once we were airborne, I stared at the wing through my window, waiting for black smoke to start pouring from the engine, for the little screws to start popping out one by one, for flames to engulf the length of the wing, for the whole structure to rip off entirely. Midway through the flight, my attention turned to the crew, and I started to study them in detail, looking at their expressions, trying to gauge if they were genuinely content or merely feigning it, if they were in fact mustering up some stoic force to repress what they knew and what we would soon find out. In the final hour we experienced some light turbulence, the fasten seatbelt lights switching on and off as we moved through the clouds. I found the noise of it awful, the constant hum and shake of the aircraft, the little jitters, the queasy drops in altitude. As we prepared to land, I reminded myself that this was perhaps the most dangerous part of the journey. I was sat towards the back of the plane, which meant that in most cases I would be among the last to die, would have a second or two of conscious thought before the explosion swallowed me. I wondered where my thoughts would go before death, whether I'd muster the clarity to summon up Hugh's face or Dawn's. After curving and dropping, my guts in turmoil, the plane landed with a bump and came to a rest. Giddy and drained, I barely registered the taxi ride, the green mountains, the winding valley roads, the little towns with shabby open-air restaurants, the hand-painted signs advertising local vineyards. The house was a solid hour from the airport, and I felt myself regaining control in the back stretch, looking through the window at the amazing sense of perspective the place supplied, these colourful houses in the foreground and these massive, almost artificial mountain ranges in the background. It was odd to be somewhere so vertical, compared to the flat, square vistas of London. We left the main road and headed down, passing a handful of smaller properties, horses in paddocks, chicken wire enclosures with hens pecking at dry straw. The road was bordered with unkempt grass and weeds, smooth tarmac giving way to mud and gravel. We crossed a small bridge and snaked up and around on the right, the houses spacing out, some with vast messy gardens, others with neatly trimmed lawns, swimming pools, built-in barbecues. I was trying to find how close we were on my phone, but the area seemed to be completely without signal. I eyeballed each house that we passed, wondering which one would be my destination. Christine Hayward and Joe Townsend were writers, both of some renown, and every summer they invited a young author, always female, often queer or somewhere in the vicinity, to spend a month with them in their Catalan summer house. This had been going on for close to 20 years and had achieved a kind of legend within certain corners. Broadsheet literary reviewers, Tumblr adolescents, Twitter losers, et al. To them, being selected was more than just a seal of approval. It was a bellwether of the shifting tides of contemporary fiction. After all, it was in that house, some 8 or 9 summers back, that Jade Byrne had started writing the Belfast Quartet, and where just 1 year before me, Anita Hughes had finished Albemarle Station. In many ways I should have been ecstatic to be their latest guest, and a few years before, emerging from my awkward adolescence, experiencing my first brushes with romance, spending an inordinate amount of time online, writing the kind of raw autofiction that made me fall in love with books, I would have had a very different response. But things had changed. After my apathetic reply to her email, my agent had called me, seesawing between anger and ecstasy. What an opportunity, she kept saying. I was less convinced, seeing within the offer a potential for the kind of crippling and prolonged anxiety I most associated with the Christmas period. The primal horror of finding myself trapped with people that I had nothing in common with, knowing that I'd committed to many more days of their company. The taxi driver left me outside the gates, heaving my suitcase from the boot and speeding off before I was even sure I had the right place. I'd seen some blurry photos of it online, shared by an over-enthusiastic fan who'd made the pilgrimage, but in person it seemed more dilapidated, with cracked tiling, worn paint, and overgrown trellises. There was a tall brick fence surrounding the house, with a solid iron gate blocking entry, both of which made the ground floor and the surrounding gardens invisible from the street. I clicked on the buzzer, awkwardly mumbled a sort of introduction, and, with a click and a screech, the gate swung open, revealing a dark blue Tesla parked in the driveway. "Pretend you haven't seen the Tesla," a voice said, and I looked to the door, where Christine Hayward was standing. She was taller than I'd imagined, wearing a flowing blue top and cream shorts, a pair of slide-on sandals, and a broad sun hat. I stood there and she strolled over, stretching out her hand. I took it. "I bought it a few years ago," she said, tapping the roof of the car. "Seems a shame to get rid of it, but I feel quite embarrassed driving it around. Anyway." She grabbed my suitcase and, despite my protestations, dragged it into the house while I followed. The entrance hall was dark, cool, dimly lit by the stairwell window. There were a few doors around me, one leading through to a living room, and one leading into what looked like a garage, with a concrete floor and several dingy side rooms. "We've put you downstairs. I hope you don't mind. Joe says it's like a dungeon, but the room has an ensuite, and it lets you have a little more privacy compared to being upstairs with us the whole time." She rolled my suitcase into the bedroom, which was compact, but a double bed, with shutters closed on the afternoon sun. "You can open all of these and get some light in if you want, but it heats up. How was the journey?" "Fine," I said. "You're in London, if I'm not mistaken." Yes," I said. "Camden." "Ah, the old haunt, though it's changed a lot since my day." It felt strange to be so close to someone that I'd spent so much of my adult life seeing pictures of. Truthfully, I felt quite uncomfortable, though she was leading the conversation, offering me a tea and inviting me to join her and Joe on the balcony in an hour or so, then hugging me briefly and heading out a door and into the garden. Once she was gone, I sat on my bed and stared at the wall for 15 minutes, before unpacking everything into the wardrobe. I cleaned several cobwebs from the upper corners and then attempted to connect my phone to roaming data, and when that failed, laid down staring at the ceiling for another 15 minutes. The hour passed, I steadied myself, and nervously ascended the stairs. The first floor of the house was built around a large living area, with a roof at least 4 or 5 meters high, covering a glass dining table and library at the far end, and a selection of thick brown sofas and chairs on the other side, loosely circling a boxy 2000s-era TV, with slivers of garden and swimming pool peeking through the slatted window behind them. In the middle of the outer wall, there was a wooden bar with a selection of dusty spirit bottles. Contributing to the distinctly 70s vibe of the space, this overwhelming collage of brown. After looking around, I followed Christine through the kitchen, again distinctly retro, with tiled brown walls and a solitary stained glass window behind the sink, and out onto a small balcony, where Jo was sat, wearing sunglasses and holding a book that I realised, with a lurch, was my own. By the looks of it, she was nearing the end, and as she saw me, she picked up a leather bookmark from the table, carefully placed it within the pages, and put the book down next to her beer. "Jo, this is Anna," Christine said, and we shook hands. I sat opposite her, looking at her expressionless face. She said nothing, just looked to the kitchen, watching as Christine poured wine and tipped olives into a small ramekin before joining us on the balcony. I turned to the garden, which was messy, overgrown, with this wooded area on my left and a crazy paving pathway leading to a swimming pool on my right. "Don't read it around her," Christine said, placing the tray between us. "It's bad form." Jo smiled, taking the book from the table and resting it on her legs, just out of sight from me. "Now then," Christine said, "despite what I've just said to my wife, we really need to talk about your book." I must have gone red, because she moved forwards. "Of course, only if you'd like to talk about it." "It's okay," I said. "I was recommended it by Giles, my old friend. Do you know Giles Robinson?" I knew of Giles Robinson, who, like many authors of his generation, predominantly wrote novels about men, usually around his age at the time of writing, and their relationships with a succession of thinly sketched women who, for reasons never clarified but easily guessed, remained trapped in their early 20s. I also knew that, somewhere out there, a journalist was probably writing the long read that would end his career, something I had attempted to do through our blog back in my university days, before being dissuaded by Dawn's father. "Yes," I said, "I know who he is." I thought it was really illuminating, in terms of capturing the feeling more than anything, because you can read 100 newspaper articles about something, anything, but to truly understand an issue, an era, a platform, is much harder, I find. I nodded, taking a big glug from the wine. "So, do you have any plans for the next few weeks?" Christine said. I looked down at the wine and back at her. "Yes," I said. "I'm working on a few things." "Second novels are tough," Christine said. "I wrote a couple of drafts of what was supposed to be my second, and ended up burning it because I couldn't make it work." I looked to Jo, who seemed completely flat. "Well, I'm hard at work on the new book at the moment," Christine said. "I can only apologise if I'm a bit busy because of that." "It's okay," I said. "This is the part of the process I really love," she said. "I've been finding the research really tiring on the last couple. I've actually had someone to help me out with it on this one, but I'm at the point now where I've got everything together, and all I need to do is breathe life into it." "Ah," I said. Christine leant across the table and briefly placed her hand over mine. "I'm so glad you've come, Anna. I think we're going to have a wonderful summer." Christine Hayward was many things to many women, a gateway into second wave feminism, a teacher, an inspiration, a powerhouse. She had emerged in the 80s with a string of novels, uniformly evocative, harsh, and accurate. At the time, she was seen as a chameleon, someone who could write about poverty in Glasgow, rich heroin addicts in London, civil war in Zimbabwe, and HIV in New York as if she had experienced them firsthand. Throughout all of this, the Booker shortlist, the BBC miniseries, the botched Hollywood adaptation, she had maintained a veil of secrecy around herself, gave few interviews, was pictured out and about with other writers of the day, but was otherwise seen as aloof, mysterious. It was in the 90s, following a 6-year break on a controversial, at the time, dabble in meta-commentary with her novel Mirror, which saw protagonist Chris Hayward navigating a breakdown following the deaths of her parents in a car crash, that something seemed to change within her. She started giving more interviews, appearing on Radio 4 and the South Bank Show, writing reviews of other novels in broadsheet newspapers and magazines. She revealed that she was a lesbian, something long rumoured, and that she had been in a relationship with the crime novelist Margaret Tandry for the previous 15 years. In time, she became something of an advocate, growing in stature and finally achieving mainstream popularity with the trio of novels she published in the late 90s. Clay Wood, about a cholera outbreak in 1830s Sheffield, Atomic, about a Las Vegas brothel in the days of nuclear tourism, and Kaleidoscope, an epic novel concerning dozens of characters across the last days of the 20th century. Having cemented herself as perhaps the preeminent British writer at the end of the last century, she had maintained her rapid pace and breadth of topic, reliably delivering a new book every couple of years, to positive reviews and decent sales, though few would argue that she was still producing vital work. It was hard not to draw a parallel between the two things that changed for her in the 21st century, settling into the role of an elder stateswoman, and the start of her relationship with Joe. Of the two of them, it was Joe who I was more curious about, as I felt like I understood Christine, having read dozens of interviews with her, and spent my summers as a teenager reading her books by the pool, either borrowing them from my mother when she was finished, or vice versa. Sitting across from her, my theories all held true. She seemed pleasant, engaged, purposeful. Joe, in stark contrast, was quiet throughout, occasionally adding a few words to one of Christine's stories, or nodding when I said something. Christine was cooking for us, but seemed to have prepared everything in advance, and I wondered if the goal behind this was to minimize the time I was left with Joe, time that passed in near complete silence, barring one particularly excruciating period of a few minutes, where I eventually asked where she was up to in the book. Joe blinked, opened the page on her lap and closed it again, before saying, "The part where you move back in with your mother." This made me nervous, like she was calling me out. After dinner, I made my excuses and went to bed. The first week passed slowly, my days filled with awkward encounters with Joe and long, one-sided conversations with Christine. I soon discovered that Christine wrote from 9 a.m. to 1 p.m. every day, in a small desk set out in the living room, shutters opened on a view over the garden and swimming pool. She wrote on an old MacBook with a stack of papers to her left. Nothing was said to me directly, but it was clear that while she was a gracious, even overbearing host at all other times of the day, this 4-hour window was one where she was not to be disturbed. On Wednesday, she spoke to me about her process, much of which I already knew from interviews I'd read over the years. "I take," she said, 1 year to read, research, and plan, 12 months. In that time, I'll take an idea and turn it into a clear structure with everything planned in advance. I know that isn't how others work. She looked to Joe, immersed in Le Monde. But when I sit down to write, I want to know exactly what I'm going to be doing, or I'll just end up wasting time. So last year I was reading and researching during the summer, which is always a bit more of a hodgepodge. And then I spent the last few months of the year meeting some really wonderful people while finalizing my plan. While Christine wrote, Joe went on hikes, despite the baking heat of the sun that July. I would sometimes see her through my window setting off just before 9, wearing these thick climbing boots and a huge blue rucksack that made her look even smaller than her 5'2" height. Most days she would return by lunch, but others she did not, something which seemed unplanned, as Christine would always lay the table for the three of us. I asked her over dinner where she was walking to, and finally, after many days of monosyllabic conversation, she talked about the local area, the mountains that dotted this part of the Pyrenees, the matted countryside paths, the castles and caves. She talked about the wild berries that grew along the mountain roads, the streams and rivers, the different animals she'd photograph on her phone. She had a deliberate manner of speech, and a faint Scottish accent that came and went. I hoped that this would mark a thawing in her demeanour, but it didn't really. For the rest of the day they seemed to busy themselves separately. Christine did a variety of chores around the house, cooked dinner, watched the news on French TV, or read in one of the plush chairs. I try not to read too much when I'm writing, she told me, in case it brushes off on me. I offered, several times over, to help out with the cooking or cleaning, but she refused, though she did grumble to me on a few occasions about how Joe was supposed to be organising repair work that summer, something it was clear she had not done. Instead, Jo spent the rest of her time reading, reclined on a sun lounger by the swimming pool. She seemed to have finished my book but made no further comment on it, moving on to a succession of other books that she was either rotating through or reading at an incredible pace. There were 2 large bookcases at the far end of the living room, which Christine informed me were mostly Joe's, covering a dozen shelves and containing everything from the Iliad to normal people, with classics famous and obscure, a wealth of 20th century fiction I'd not heard of, and whole shelves of newer work, including my own. When she wasn't hiking or reading, I'd see her venturing into town, returning with bread and pastries in the morning, or magazines and wine in the afternoon. I never saw her write, and didn't feel like I could bring it up. Over that first week, I started to sense that something was not quite right. Here were two women living broadly separate lives, one keen to make me feel at home and the other completely ambivalent to my presence. But I spotted very little in terms of a shared life, little in the way of expressions or gestures, no touching, kissing. Once, when Christine was busy writing and Joe was out on a hike, I spied into their bedroom through the open door, seeing a plain double bed, perhaps the only real evidence from my first week that they were even in a relationship. Over that first week, it was also becoming increasingly difficult to hide the fact that I had nothing to write. Christine and Joe would leave me alone for hours on end each day. Then in the evenings, Christine would ask me about my day's progress, or mention upcoming literary conferences and deadlines for competitions. Time and time again, Christine would bring up my novel, telling me on one occasion that it gave me the most fascinating insight into young people, if you mind the term, who use the internet for everything: reading, writing, friendships, work, sex. I found it all quite revealing. My novel was a loosely fictionalized recounting of 5 years in my life across the mid to late 2010s, mostly while attending King's College. I'd moved into an exorbitant private room next door to Dawn, rechristened Samantha in the book, who was also on the English literature course with me. We became immediate friends, and the relationship turned sexual after a few months. I'd only dated men previously, but had suspected that there was something wrong throughout my one serious relationship in college. This dim awareness that I was supposed to be feeling things that I clearly was not. Being with Dawn changed my life. In many ways, I felt like I was reborn. We'd both spent a lot of time on Tumblr as teenagers, and towards the end of the first year, we started a page around our experiences at King's and across London in general, which we quickly moved to its own website, titled Floozy. We were late for the blog boom, but somehow things took off. We started a podcast, wrote pithy essays about the horrible male books we were being forced to read, the best clubs in London, the awful things happening to women around the campus. Until this point, we were mainly read by other London students. But after a post by me detailing how one of our senior professors had a history of groping students went viral, things changed. At 21, we were suddenly appearing on big podcasts, giving talks at conferences across London, even getting paid to appear at a nightclub on one occasion. While sitting our final exams, we signed with a literary agent and inked a deal to write a book together, a kind of Gen Z feminist Bible, the plan for which was little more than a bullet point list on my notes app. In the background of all of this, cracks were beginning to show. Dawn and I had spent our entire lives together for 3 years, and it was starting to catch up on me. I no longer felt bowled over by her. Her friends grew to annoy me, and, frankly, the gulf in quality between our written work, something that had always been there, had grown to the point that it was plain to everyone with even a passing knowledge of the site. Using the advance from the book, we moved into a shared flat, and I quickly embarked on a series of affairs while Dawn spiraled into a fairly serious drug habit. We addressed neither. During the day, we'd occasionally do some writing, update the blog, record our podcast, and then at night she'd go dancing with her gaze, snort a gram or so of coke or ket, and return to the empty flat stinking of booze, on one occasion quite literally wetting the bed, while I would be elsewhere, sleeping with sub-editors, gossip journalists, school tutors and bankers, both female and male. This went on for 6 months or so, before Dawn's father, a notorious Coca-Cola lobbyist, sent her to rehab, and the half-finished mess of a book we'd sent to the publisher received such a scabrous response that I cried in the shower after reading it, telling my agent that it was all over. We folded the website. I returned what I could of the advance thanks to a loan from my father, and I moved back in with my mother and her husband. There, feeling completely alone, I started to write again, quickly circling back to my own story. 8 months later, I had a draft, which I emailed to my agent, the first thing I'd sent her in close to a year, asking her if she'd be interested in taking me on alone. She was, leading to several years of redrafting and feedback, more than a few alterations mandated by lawyers, and then, finally, to its release. In many ways, my book, titled Centuries of Youth, a line from Brideshead Revisited suggested by my agent, arrived at the perfect time. Dawn and I had ridden a lot of waves across the 2010s. The blog era, podcast culture, Me Too, the hashtag resistance to Trump and Brexit, even the girl boss phenomenon that we thankfully dismissed as capitalist propaganda at the time. But in 2024, the book read as a commentary on that period, in many ways a far more withering one than I'd ever really intended. I'd simply written what had happened at a dark point in my life, and now it was being paraded around as a skewering of the idea that young people should be taken seriously, or that using independent methods to call out terrible behaviour was somehow a bad thing. One website even called it a long overdue reckoning with empty girl boss feminism. I was glad to have found success and to have pulled something from the chaos of those years, but I was uncomfortable from the start with the idea that the things I'd fought for were somehow empty or unimportant, and nervous about the sorts of people who seemed to be embracing the book because of this. In the years spent finishing the book, I'd also worked for a publisher reviewing manuscripts, all of which were, like my novel, short, mean, and blatantly autobiographical, an ordeal that curdled my love with the very wave I knew I was riding. Amidst this general disillusionment, I moved back to London, dated Hugh for a dispiriting 18 months, and slumped into a period of quite sustained misery. I'd spent the year since the book's publication fielding endless questions about what I would write next, from interviewers, family, and, with increasing seriousness, my agent. And the truth was I had nothing. Unlike Christine, I couldn't place myself in another person's head, or even pretend to, couldn't move beyond my own life, all of which I'd already strip-mined for content. After a week I plucked up the courage to ask Christine about her new book. Given how gregarious she'd been, or at least the impression of candour she'd seemed keen to give off, it was becoming increasingly obvious that there was a gap there. We'd had a few glasses of wine, and she looked a little tired. A lot of the time she didn't really look her age, but that night she seemed worn out. "I guess I can talk about it a little bit," she said. "It's about a transition from male to female, and the life of a trans woman called Erin in America." "Okay," I said. She stopped, as if thinking. "It's not a transition narrative. I mean, it is, but it's more about issues that everyone is facing, economic issues, climate issues, the rise of authoritarianism." I don't think I'm describing it very well, sorry. "You said it's more of a thriller," Joe said, chiming in. Yes, I suppose, about the dangers that trans women face." I'd noticed it the first time, but it seemed more pronounced the second time around. There was, not quite a pause, but certainly a stumble, every time she said the words, trans woman. So I've been reading a lot of the trans literature that's been coming out, and I went to America and met some really fascinating women to talk about their experiences. That's the thing. She almost exhaled as she said it. You have to be very careful now, writing about others' experiences, which I've always tried to do, but it can be a thing that trips you up. "Yeah," I said. Well, you're young and online, so you know already. I didn't like what I had to go through with the last book. Her previous book, Our Girls, about a group of teenage girls being groomed online into joining ISIS, had received the usual round of glowing reviews from newspapers, and the usual solid but unspectacular sales, followed, about a week later, by an outpouring of online fury that had threatened to go supernova. Christine had gone on damage control, put out a vague corporate speak apology, removed a handful of passages from subsequent printings, and promised to donate some of the profits to charity. In many ways, it was a model example of how to handle that sort of thing, removing the morality of the situation from it. She had successfully quelled the backlash and retained her national treasure status with only the faintest of blemishes. Things get out of hand easily. That was my feeling with the last one. I'd consulted dozens of experts, even worked with a sensitivity reader, which I'd always been against. I knew I'd done everything right, and suddenly these anonymous people start taking bits and pieces out of context and posting them online. And a few days later, my agent and publisher sat me down and said, "Here's exactly what you need to do, or you might never publish a book again." She was looking down at her hands. So part of me felt like, well, time to never write about the modern world again, but that's a straitjacket to me. That's not how I write. It's all been quite challenging. "It's not challenging," Joe said. "It's ridiculous. We've let people who don't understand art police it. We've welcomed a new era of censorship by the same people who've helped make the left unelectable. And all the while a rapist rules the free world and our leaders deny the genocide they're funding." Christine smirked at Joe, gesturing to the wine glass. Maybe too much of that. Joe laughed, the first time I'd seen her do this, raised her hands, and left the table. Once she was out of earshot, Christine returned to me. It was a very scary few days. To watch something I'd been building for 50 years seem to fall apart overnight. I thought about retiring, packing it all in, because of the criticism. And believe me, I've had my share of pans. I'm not against criticism. But there was a feeling of just that these people weren't playing the same game as me, if that makes sense. I nodded, glad that the furore hadn't erupted a few years earlier, as I knew that I would have waded in, would probably have delighted in her humiliation. Truthfully, the extracts from the book that caused the uproar were ill-considered, even to someone like me who knew very little about the situation. As people online had a tendency to do, there was a concerted effort in the days following the original Firestorm to pull in evidence from her other books. Dialogue from a Pakistani cab driver in Kaleidoscope, racial slurs and ableist language in Atomic, problematic tropes and depictions of the gay community or Zimbabwean politics. Much of this was so stripped of context as to be near libelous, but nonetheless it helped to shape something of a consensus amongst young people online who, truthfully, were very unlikely to read her books anyway. That Christine Hayward was just another privileged white woman who got her kicks writing about marginalised people and their trauma. Christine poured us both a final glass of wine. Leaning back in her chair, she sniffed, looked over my shoulder into the garden, licking her lips and taking a sip. "You know," she said, "I have been writing pretty much constantly since the 1970s. The only time I ever stopped for more than a few days was after my parents had the accident. After they died, sorry. And that was the worst year of my life. I barely remember writing about it afterwards. I wrote the book in a very disorganized fashion by my standards. And then thankfully I came back around, similar in some ways, but different in a lot of others." "That's why you came out?" I asked. "Oh, I've been out since the 80s, she said, her expression sliding back into the rictus grin I'd come to recognize. "A lot of people think I came out once my parents died, but that's just not true." "Okay," I said, but I didn't believe her. "Look, Anna," Christine said, "I just wanted to say while we're alone that I'm sorry if Joe is being standoffish." I didn't know what to respond, and in the end said nothing. She's normally a lot more chipper, but, well, there's still time. Last year her and Anita got on like a house on fire. "I'm sorry," I said. "Oh, don't apologize, dear, you're perfectly lovely." I felt strange sat there, talking with her, like I was a teenager pretending to be an adult. I wasn't young, but it struck me, as I lay in bed that night, that I'd never had a genuine social engagement with someone that much older than me before. I wasn't sure what to make of Christine, my initial response eroding by the day as it became more and more obvious to me that something felt off about her. As we'd talked that evening, it had felt to me like a mask had been pulled back, just for a moment, but instead of revealing depths, it had revealed contradictions. The version of Christine in interviews, in person, felt increasingly inauthentic to me, and I didn't know what to do about it. The next day, just after 8:30, a knock at my door woke me. I scrambled to throw on the clothes that I'd left on the floor and opened it a crack. Joe was standing there, holding a baguette and a bag of croissants from the bakery in town. We ate in silence, Joe flicking through the newspaper, occasionally tearing off a corner of croissant and placing it within her mouth. After breakfast, I showered quickly, put on a battered pair of Converses, my closest approximation of a walking shoe, and set off after her. Strangely, once we left the road and ventured out into the wilderness, she started to talk, quite naturally. "It's not my scene," she said. "All the interviews and awards and conferences and all that faff." I said something about how most writers seemed quite asocial to me, that they treated these structures as a necessary evil to be appeased. I guess, maybe I got lucky in that respect, but the few times I've dipped my toes in I haven't much liked what I found. I had a real chip on my shoulder back then, being from where I was from. It was a bit of a wedge between us, Chris and I, at first. That she was, I started, privileged, they'd probably say now, a toff, a bit of a silver spoon case, you know. She hid it in interviews, but when you come down to uni you can spot who's been privately educated. They carry themselves differently. They have a confidence that things are going to go their way. I asked her if she liked university. No, she said, no, but it got me out of a bad situation and it opened lots of doors for me, so I'll never knock it entirely. Jo was the rare author, like me, to be published in her mid-20s. Unlike me, her novel had moved beyond the in-crowd and become a genuine cultural moment. Released in 2000, the vision had become a kind of mystical life event for young people across the 21st century, still inspiring Pinterest mood boards and BookTok fan casts. Detailing a year in the life of a 19-year-old woman living in a succession of squats across London, the plot described a downward spiral of sex and drugs and mental illness, but the prose was so crooked and surreal that the whole thing felt like a fairy tale. There was a genuine magic to it that I felt keenly when reading it over a decade after publication, at age 16. It was in the aftermath of this success that her and Christine became an item. In the decades since, the timeline had been endlessly dissected by online weirdos, so while Christine had never acknowledged it, it was fairly clear that the end of her relationship with Margaret Tandry and the beginning of her relationship with Jo had had some sort of overlap. That Christine was nearing 50 and Jo was 24 was a cause for much hand-wringing at the time, some staggeringly ill-judged interview questions, and huge volumes of gossip. While Christine was well on her way towards becoming a public figure, Jo never seemed comfortable with the limelight, and once the dust was settled on the vision, she was rarely seen in public again. It was 14 years before she published another book. In that time, the summer residency had already become a legendary event, and whispers of a new work drew a flurry of blogs, news articles, and tweets. In a move she probably came to regret, the title, plot, and cover were gradually revealed as part of a months-long publicity campaign. Her publishers no doubt keen to maximise their returns after so many years of waiting. The massive hype that greeted the release of The Private Life of Mariana Newbridge made its disappointment all the more magnificent. While the professional reviews ran the gamut from bemused confusion to outright hostility, the response from readers was uniformly apoplectic. The book, concerning, unsurprisingly, the private life of Mariana Newbridge, took what had worked in her first novel and twisted it until it broke, with a stupefyingly dull plot stretched across 700 excruciating pages, leadened further by prose that was like wading through treacle, rendering it all but unreadable to my 18-year-old self. Within days of release, the pitchforks were out and the novel was declared a disaster. And here I was, nearly 10 years later, following her up a mountain path. After a few hours, we stopped within the stone ruins of a church, maybe 1,000 meters up. It was overlooking a steep cliff, with trees poking through the open roof. They carried the stones all the way up by hand, Jo said. It took them years, decades, all for this. She panned the wreckage with her hand. It makes you wonder why anyone bothers. Without saying anything more, she sat down on the stone altar and retrieved 2 sandwiches from her rucksack, alongside a flask of coffee with a separate cup for me. We ate, looking out through the arched door towards the mountains and the forest, watching a stream idle through the valley and, in the distance, a quiet road, cars punctuating the stillness every minute or two. "I'm sorry if I seem standoffish," Jo said, finally. "I promise I'm not usually this... I don't know." "It's okay," I said. "It can't be easy having a stranger in your house." "No, it's not that. It's just... I don't know, call it a midlife crisis. Is it about a book? I asked. She laughed in front of me for the second time, her legs dangling below her. No, she said, it's not about my books. Before arriving in France, I'd had two theories about Jo's long-rumoured third novel. The first, that she was sitting on some unfinished 2,000-page behemoth, a morass of detail and character that she couldn't wrestle into the masterpiece she felt she needed to deliver. And the second, that she had hundreds of bits of character, bits of plot, abortive strands littering drawers and desktops, but no singular focus, no big idea, nothing, again, resembling a finished book. Sat in the ruined church, it struck me that there was a third option I'd not even considered. She had nothing. On the walk back, she turned the conversation to me, something she hadn't really done until that point. Is your blog still up? The one you wrote about? I laughed, a bit out of awkwardness. Yes, yeah, it's still up. We wound down all the podcast and stuff, but the site's still up. Are people seeking it out now that you've written the book about it? Well, the book is not, I thought through my words. The book is ultimately a work of fiction. Sure, but it's gone up a bit. We had ads and referral links and stuff like that, and it's all picked up a bit. How did your ex-girlfriend feel about the book? I looked to her, walking on my left, and she was staring straight at me, framed by a row of trees. She was okay, yeah. We had a chat and she asked me to cut a few bits, which I thought was fair. The character isn't really based on her, it's more of a composite, really. The character, Samantha, wasn't just based on Dawn, she was Dawn. The early draft of the book, which I'd sent over to Dawn on my agent's insistence, went so far as to use text messages she'd sent me verbatim, recounted arguments and drunken pratfalls as closely as I could remember them, used quotes from her shoddiest articles to illustrate her lack of talent. This had led to a lengthy back and forth, with her father calling in a string of favours to threaten legal action against me. Incidents were changed, everything from lines of dialogue to whole chapters were cut or rewritten. I even, on his insistence, made Samantha Spanish. Throughout all of this I didn't speak to Dawn, just her father or one of his lawyers. Jo was looking at me with a tiny smile. How did your parents feel? My mother, portrayed as coddling but ultimately sympathetic, was not displeased with my depiction of her. Her husband Stephen was a little more perturbed, telling me once when she was out of the room that I should have asked for her permission. My father was more upset, though he didn't have the words to tell me. The financial nature of our relationship was something that I'd leaned on at my darkest points, but I had often struggled to feel understood by him, which I'd tried to articulate in the book. I turned back to Jo. They liked it, I said. Jo turned away from me and picked up her speed. I didn't speak to my parents for 6 or 7 years after I left home, Jo said, but when the book came out they came down to London to find me. I think they were convinced that it was about me. My mum kept saying, why didn't you tell us when, it wasn't about me at all really. It was mainly about a girl I was living with at the time who ended up dying before the book even came out. I'm sorry, I said. It's okay, Jo said. I was always an observer in that world, really. A lot of them didn't trust me. People used to think I was undercover police or something. She laughed. Just because I was always writing stuff down. By the time I moved out of the squats, I had all these notepads filled with anecdotes and dialogue and bits of description, which I then kind of made the book out of through, a kind of collage, I guess. Right, I said. I think it was a coping mechanism, really. Just a way of feeling above this situation I was in, being homeless, drugs, dodgy encounters, no family I could really rely on. When did you leave home? 16, she said. My dad was an alcoholic, difficult guy, so I got on a train and got out. Ended up meeting some girls in similar positions, breaking into old buildings, things like that. Jesus. I don't know, it doesn't seem real now. It didn't seem real at the time. I used to say I was doing research, she laughed. Just sitting there with my notepad stealing their lives. How did you get out? Well, I kicked the drugs, just like that. I don't think I'm a very addictive person. Then I was like it's time, and I got everything and went to a women's shelter. They set me up with a couple of charities, got a flat, finished my A-levels, got on the writing degree, worked in pubs, wrote, finished the book, sent it around, and then she shrugged. That's amazing, she snorted. I don't know, I said. Obviously, I think it's important to write what you know. Really? Yeah. I don't think so, Joe said. To me, it's a book. You're always pretending anyway. I don't see why you can't pretend to be someone else. I considered asking her about her second novel, but something held me back. What? I bit my lip. Go on. Well, what about Mariana Newbridge? That was about you too, wasn't it? We'd emerged from the woods out onto a dirt road, the final stretch leading back to the house. She waited for maybe 15 seconds to reply. I guess it was about this world I'd found myself pulled into, this world of parties and boring toffs and award shows and press interviews, and I guess it was about the upper class, arty, city-based kind of, I don't know. What made you want to write it? She exhaled. I didn't write anything for years and years, for whatever reason. And I did some editing, and I had a bit of a back and forth around the film that never really came to much. And I don't know, I went a bit crazy, I think. I had a breakdown, really, when I was 30 or so. My dad died, cirrhosis, and my mum kind of tried to come back into my life again. I don't know, really. This isn't much of an answer, I know. I just wrote it, basically, over a year or so. And no one had the heart to tell me that I shouldn't publish it. Obviously, agents and publishers only saw the money, but I don't know. You read it, I guess. Yeah, I said. Anita Hughes, sorry. She told me that some people are starting to come round to it, which I have to imagine she was just flattering me. It went over my head a bit, I said. She laughed, very diplomatic. Do you think you'll write again? I don't know, Joe said. It's a strange thing. It just doesn't bother me that much. I wonder what that says about me. We walked some more. Go on, she said. What? Ask me what I do all day, every day. Well, I stuttered. It's not... You don't have to. I walk, I think, I read, I handle some of the more boring day-to-day stuff for Chris. Anita said I was a housewife, but I don't cook and I don't really clean. Ah, I said. And maybe something will stir up and I'll write another one, but I don't need to. There's not that nagging thing inside me that Chris has eating away at her. That week we went on several more walks, discussed art, our lives, the modern world. Joe had a contrarian, almost conservative streak that emerged at points, endlessly quibbling whatever I had to say about liberalism or youth culture. For whatever reason, we never talked about her and Christine. On Saturday evening we drove to a village about half an hour away. Christine was driving and I was sat in the back. Weirdly, I felt like they were my parents, the way they kept making eye contact with me in the mirror. Christine was talking about the car and her regret at buying it. People see it as a Nazi car. I'm worried that someone will scratch it if I park somewhere public. Sell it, get something else, Joe said. Christine exhaled. If I sell it, then I'll look wasteful, and if I keep it, I'll look like a Nazi. I wish I'd never bought it. You either need to make peace with this car or get another one, Joe said, and Christine bristled before lapsing into silence. That moment in the car, like many other times that summer, I was struck by the contrast between the two of them, and even more confused by the inverse dynamics in their writing. Jo was plain-spoken, unadorned, blunt, but her prose was dense, extravagant, bejeweled with ostentatious word choices, long unbroken sentences, and obscure, downright mystifying descriptions of items and places. Christine, however, despite her seemingly all-consuming desire to impress, and despite the scope, sweep, and scale of her books, wrote with comprehension in mind, with simple, unadorned sentences designed to engage a reader with her characters and plot, not to dazzle. The relationship between who they are and what they wrote was something that, despite my best efforts, I never really understood. I realized that no one had said anything for close to a minute. "What's the opera?" I said. "Saul," Christine said. "Never seen it before?" I've actually never seen an opera," I said. "Oh, well, you'll get swept up in it. They put one on every summer. Miraculous, really. You'd easily mistake them for professionals." Joe made an expression towards me in the mirror as if to say, "No, you wouldn't." The sun was down, but it was still warm. I was wearing a t-shirt and felt underdressed compared to the others in the audience, who all seemed to have put on their fineries. Old men in pressed suits, women in long gowns, children in neat little shirts and dresses with their hair pleated or combed to the side. The stage was set up in the town square, with 100 or so folding chairs sat facing it. Christine recognized a few people and wandered off from her seat, shaking hands, kissing cheeks. "She does this," Joe said. In the weeks I'd been there, I'd noticed that they'd neither visited nor been visited by any of the locals, but Christine seemed to know several groups tonight. "She doesn't like to over-socialize when she's writing," Joe said, as if she'd burrowed into my brain. "She runs writing workshops sometimes. Well, she hasn't in a while." Christine was kissing a woman sat in a wheelchair. "She runs a restaurant. Ran it anyway. I think her sons do most of the work now, a couple of villages over. It's a nice place." A bell sounded and Christine scurried back to her seat. "The Sheridans are selling," she said. "Craig said they're getting too old to look after it." I was sat between them, and as the music started I felt strange again, though I couldn't really pinpoint why. The opera was, oddly, sung in English, though the accents and the singing made it difficult to decipher. It told the story of the aftermath of David and Goliath's fight, with David earning the praise and later scorn of Saul, the king of Israel. The set was fairly minimal, but the costumes were beautiful, and the singing, though not professional by any means, was strong. I was drinking red wine from a glass that Joe kept refilling, and the music overwhelmed me at points. The band was set up in front of the stage and was a peculiar mix of young and old, in a way that was quite moving to me. I wondered, as I often did when I consumed art, how exactly the story functioned as a metaphor for my life at that point. If Christine was like Saul, increasingly mad and clinging to power, if I was like David, played by a woman in the production, being lifted into a society whose rules I didn't understand. After the show was over, Christine excused herself and headed over to the musicians, hugging the cellist, a tiny older woman, before fanning her arm theatrically across the stage. "Let's go for a walk," Joe said, leading me out of the square and up the hill. It was dark, with shuttered windows and a dim, half-empty moon guiding us along the cobbled street. We paused below a church with a cracked steeple, ivy climbing around its walls. "It's a very old building," she said. "Like a lot of these things, I think most of it's been rebuilt, but the steeple is from the 1600s. "It looks like it's going to fall down," I said. "They're talking about trying to repair it, but it's going to cost too much, really. It's fascinating inside. It's a great example of primitivism, which has always struck me as a harsh name to describe the style, but the whole thing has a kind of chunky amateur look to it, the paintings and the sculptures. It's lovely." "Are you religious?" I asked. Joe tilted her head back and forth. "Not in the traditional sense, no. I suppose I see a lot of possibility in the universe, but religions are stories, and I've read a lot of stories, so I know one when I see it." She started walking and I followed, ducking into a narrow alleyway between two houses. "Watch out for dog muck," Joe said, placing her hand around my wrist and sending a spike of goosebumps up my arm. I was walking behind her, my head above hers, her body close to mine. She didn't look to me, or say anything really. Just led me for those 20 or 30 meters that seemed to stretch on, my heart beating, my head unable to focus on anything else. We emerged from the alleyway and the dream punctured, her hand falling from mine in a second. We were on another street, a few plastic tables and chairs outside with a dozen or so people sat around them. Joe looked to the bar and then back to me. "We'd better get back." Christine was still talking to one of the singers when we arrived, beckoning us to join her. She introduced the two of us in French, and I smiled blankly as the three of them exchanged a minute or so of conversation, after which we waved goodbye to those still milling about and headed back to the car. The drive home was silent. I looked at the outlines of mountains and trees through the window, at my hands in my lap, at the two of them, sat just in front of me. I excused myself after we arrived and went into my room, stripping to my underwear and putting on a different t-shirt. I brushed my teeth and got into bed. I lay there staring at the ceiling, my thoughts racing, unable to let go of things, images of that alleyway, the wine, the church on the hill, a swirl of image and sound, babbling and overlapping, then fading. I could hear something. A scratching, a scraping, as if a heavy object was being dragged around upstairs. I had the window in my room open an inch to let some air in, and I got out of bed, putting my ear to the gap to better hear the jarring, sudden sounds. This continued for a few more minutes. I paced the room, sat on the side of the bed staring at the door, laid back down, rolling from side to side. I started to think of excuses for going upstairs. I thought about saying I needed a glass of water, but there was a tap in the downstairs living room that I'd been using for the past few weeks. Eventually I decided to say, in the hypothetical scenario where I was discovered, that I was getting something from the kitchen, that I was writing and needed a snack. I left my shoes off to avoid making a noise and stepped out, slowly crossing the cold tiles and approaching the stairwell. The main light upstairs wasn't on, but there was a muted glow, maybe the light in the landing. I crept up the staircase, sidestepping the pot plants and turning the corner to approach the landing. The kitchen was on my left, their room, a halo of light around its half-open door, was on my right. I couldn't see it without heading towards it and jeopardizing my narrative. "I don't like watching you like this," I heard Christine say. I waited for a response, but there was nothing. "You spend 2 weeks ignoring her, and now you're doing the old crumbling church's death of history, seize the moment routine whenever my back's turned." "I don't know what you want to hear," Joe said. "I want to hear that you support me," Christine said, getting louder. "I want to hear that you value the way that I look after you. I want to hear that you aren't going to try to fuck another one of our guests. I mean, Jesus, Joe, she's in her 20s. "Don't speak to me like that," Joe said. "I'm not some paid companion. You can't just order me around and demand I perform for you and whoever else you're trying to impress that day. I have a life, you know." "In what sense?" Christine said. I heard footsteps and dashed down the stairs, terrified that I'd been heard or spotted. I crouched, panting on the ground floor, watching the stairwell in utter horror. A minute passed and I silently crept to my room, turning off the light and getting into bed. I lay there churning with worries that I would wake up to a stern conversation, a last-minute flight back to London, a reputation in tatters. Instead, I woke up to something much worse. Emerging bleary-eyed onto the balcony, I squinted as my vision adjusted to the third person sat at the table. I'd never met him, but I'd learned much about Giles Robinson from rumours, gossip, blind items. He was in his 60s, maybe a few years younger than Christine, with his long thinning hair slicked back, a shirt with a few buttons undone, this light patch of chest hair poking out. He leant back in the chair, smiling over at me. "Anna, this is Giles." "Giles, Anna," Christine said. I was holidaying in the area," Giles said. "Christine invited me to pop over." I sat across from him, thinking about all the things I'd heard, the fact that, if I was a bit more rash, I could have ended his career 8 or 9 years ago. I grabbed a croissant and started to butter it. "Anyway," Giles said, "I was just talking to Chris and Joe about your book and how much I enjoyed it." "Thank you," I said, almost as a reflex. I can't say I read a lot of new fiction. It's always been a fault of mine, as Chris can attest. "We used to call him Dusty," she said, laughing, "because he wouldn't read a book from this century. Or last century now, I suppose. Jesus." But I found it fascinating. very illustrative of these parts of the world that he gestured to Christine and himself, only see these fatuous impressions of. What? I managed. Just that, well, I like to think I haven't soured entirely, but a lot of people my age, he said with a grimace, tend to get their information, news, culture, what have you, from utterly compromised sources. The Mail, Facebook, GB News, you name it. Whereas if you look to younger people or left-wing sources, you often find yourself with things that paint a picture that, well, that I at least can't really take seriously. I felt like your book was a balanced, empathetic, very funny, not quite takedown, but deprecation, I suppose, of a generation. Without being overly negative, Christine said, well, no, of course, because it's fundamentally about real people, and real people haven't changed. I think that's very easy to say as someone in your position, Joe said. He held up his hands, smirking. To clarify, if you'll allow it, I don't mean in terms of values, I mean in terms of character. The average 27-year-old living today, he gestured to me as I sullenly ate the croissant, holds very different views on all sorts of topics compared to a 27-year-old 40 years ago. Of course they do, and how wonderful for them. But the fundamental drives motivating a person, the things they do and the reasons they do them, are unchanged. Despite the endless protestations to the contrary, people are self-interested at their core, now and forever. People want things for themselves, and they want to feel like a good person while getting them. And, perhaps most importantly, they want to hate. The dynamics have shifted a tad, but the modern world, from GB News to, TikTok, not that I really know what that is built around the same things. People want to feel like a good person, so they post things online about how good of a person they are. They assume identities that showcase them as good people to others. And people want to hate. And whether that's hating the woke, queer panopticon or hating aging white men, cathedrals of hate are being erected for our pleasure. Christine picked up a croissant from the bag and put it on his plate. Have another croissant, Giles, and talk about something else. I don't think this is your audience. He laughed, picking it up and ripping out a huge bite. The conversation flowed from there, mostly between Christine and Giles, though Jo occasionally fired back something barbed from behind her newspaper. Giles had a broadly predictable personality, that of someone who had been fated so much and for so long that he had come to believe himself as some sort of oracle, when in fact the extent of his insight essentially boiled down to his immediate circumstances and concerns, aided by a few tidbits of geopolitics and culture war detritus picked up from Radio 4 and The Times. Giles has been teaching this year, Christine eventually said, to me, as if she were trying to lasso me back into the conversation. He held up his hand. Oh, let's not talk about them. Oh, let's, Christine said. Surely there are some bright lights. It's, he said, chuckling, and I absolutely didn't tell you this. There are one or two who maybe, and I mean maybe, could put together something half decent in the future. One is a young woman not entirely unlike your guest here. One is a young, Muslim man. Both are quiet in seminars, have poor attendance, and seem broadly uninterested in my input or feedback. They are the bright lights. The other however many, 40, 50, are completely and utterly without talent. Christine laughed, slapping him on the back. Oh, Giles. Chris has never had to teach because her books sell a lot more than mine, so she doesn't know, but it's true, and there's nothing to say, nothing to do. If it was up to me, I'd sit them down at the end of the first term and tell them, go home, save your money. Writing is a thing to hone and sharpen and practice, always and forever, but it's not something that can be taught. Christine rocked her head back and forth. What do you think, Anna? She said. I swallowed, words failing me. I guess I think structure can help people to improve. But what's the point in improving when there is a mile-wide canyon between where you are and where you need to be that you will never cross, Giles said. And believe me, these young people, will not cross it. After breakfast, Christine stopped me in the kitchen, just to say that Giles and I are going to stop over for the night in Perpignan. We're seeing some old friends together, and I don't think I'm going to have the energy to drive back. Oh, okay, I said. You'll have to fend for yourself when it comes to dinner. Maybe if you ask nicely, Joe will take you to the place in town, though it's nothing to write home about. With that, she swooped off, and I was left wondering why this woman who so stridently advertised her feminist ideals had a chummy, lifelong friendship with a known sex pest. Why said sex pest had materialized the morning after what appeared to be a massive argument with her wife. Why my host, so garrulous and attentive, had failed to mention a 2-day trip to me in advance. I watched the Tesla silently leave the house, realizing that Giles must have come there by taxi. Jo was washing her trainers under the outside tap. I looked at her from a distance, lingering, as if waiting for her to beckon to me. I wasn't sure if she could see me, and as I watched her furiously scrape mud from her shoes, it dawned on me that she could not. I wondered if she would attempt to get me from inside the house, or if she would simply leave without me. She looked up, squinted, and waved for me to join her. We took a different walk, following a stream alongside and under a road, at points 5 or so meters below it, at times level. We didn't talk about what had happened for a bit, instead talking about the news. My data had been non-functioning the whole time, and the Wi-Fi was hit and miss, so I had only the vaguest notions of what was going on in the world. Chris is worried about doing press at the moment, Jo said, clambering from rock to rock. She thinks she'll say something that will get taken out of context, or that they'll ask her about Israel. They'll definitely ask her about Israel, I said. I think things are sufficiently, she waved her hand in a circle, by this point that you can just come out and say the word genocide and not have it be this big thing, but I told her not to do any press at all, but she's too proud. I'm not sure she can just put out a trans novel without having to justify it a bit, I said. Jo smirked before rolling her eyes at me. She's 73, the people who read her books are going to carry on reading them. I don't know why she's so desperate that young people must like her, when young men flat out don't read, and young women, at best, read the sort of stuff you're writing, but mostly seem to be reading romance books or just actual pornography. She's worried about her legacy, but who's even going to be reading books in 50 years? It felt like an insult, though I wasn't sure why. What are young people supposed to be reading? She laughed. Well, I know how you feel about the classics after reading your book. I don't know. It's a bit disappointing to me. A generation who came up with complete access to all of history, art, language, culture, and they came out allergic to all the things that make life interesting, just a flat, boxed up, sexless existence. How many young people do you know? I said. About 1 a year, and they all seem to be seeing and writing about the same things. You sound like a certain someone. No, she said. Don't play that card. Like, I said, I know he's her friend, but he's not my friend, Jo said. He's vile, and I've heard things about him. What sort of things? She said, with a little snort. Just, the things that powerful men usually do. Charles is a dinosaur, Jo said. He's a man from a different era who doesn't realize the music has stopped. I had to deal with men like Giles when I was young, and Chris had to deal with them when she was young. When he's gone, I don't think he'll be missed, and I don't think he'll be replaced. She sniffed. But for all his faults, he's been a good friend to Chris over the years. He walked her down the aisle, We were coming up underneath Villefranche de Conflans, a walled town that we'd visited for lunch a week before. From where we stood, it towered over us, like we were paddling in a shallow moat. Jo took off her hat and fanned herself with it, sitting down on a rock overlooking the river, shaded entirely by the road and the steep walls of the town. I stood by her until she tapped to her right, and I, with a gulp, sat next to her. I don't doubt that Giles is... She twirled her hand again. But is he the villain? A lot of the time it feels like this silly distraction to just pick and choose one famous person to destroy each week. Is that really fixing anything? I think it is, yeah, I said. I think men behave differently now compared to 10 years ago. Okay, maybe, Jo said, biting her lip, but look at the world today. A Western-backed genocide unfolding live on our phones, America becoming a fascist dictatorship, the West reeling from an endless war, economic inequality, rising costs of living, the long-term impacts of our, colonial agendas, both historic and modern. And that's not even getting to the likely annihilation that's coming from climate change, nuclear escalation, lab-built diseases. The way of life that has existed for us in this part of the world for the last 80 years is over. Does it really matter that an old, irrelevant writer used to get his cock out from time to time? I furrowed, thinking through what I'd said. I never mentioned that. She smiled. I hear stories too, you know. A set of stairs behind us led up to Villefranche, which was 1,000 years old, with cobbled streets full of shops, squares with restaurants, boxy French cars parked haphazardly. Jo led me up to the battlements, which were empty, giving a view over the valley, the river we'd followed snaking alongside the road into the distance, dipping from view, crossing beneath it. I turned to her and she was looking at me. "I'm not happy, Anna," she said, so casually that I almost laughed, stifling it as I realized she was being serious. "Okay," I said. She took my hand before leaning up to kiss me. I froze, staring at her as she leant back. "So," she said. End of part 1. Part 2. Clara Hastings was sat at a table in a London bookshop. She was signing copies of a book titled Endless Summer, her signature a vague scribble that changed each time. She'd just finished a reading, which had been well attended, with dozens of copies sold. The staff of the bookshop were tidying away while she sat there at the small table, looking around, looking at them, but not saying anything. "Great reading," one of the women said. "Oh, thank you," Clara said. "You must be pleased with the reception." Yes. Yes." The door of the shop opened with a scrape, and a woman walked in. "We're actually closing," one of the staff members said, but Helen ignored her, walking over to the table where Clara had got out her phone and banging her hand on it. Clara started, and upon seeing Helen, recoiled back in her seat. "Didn't expect to see me." Clara said. "What kind of fucking nerve? Look me in the eyes while I talk to you. What kind of nerve? Do you hate us? Is that it? Do you want to ruin our lives? Do you think you can just make things up about me, about my wife?" I'm sorry," Clara said. "I wanted to get a lawyer in, but Jane couldn't face it. Her life's work made into a mockery by a freeloading brat without an inch of creative thought in her body." Helen was pacing back and forth. "And for what? What are you going to do now? What bridge is there left for you to burn? We took you into our home, made you welcome, and you twisted us and our lives and made something wholly fabricated from the pieces, because you don't understand us, you don't understand anyone, you certainly don't understand yourself. And not only do you not understand anyone, you don't understand love, you don't understand companionship, friendship, nuance, values. You think people are these sad little figures you can just take and take from." Clara was looking down at the table, her shoulders raised. One of the shop attendants was surreptitiously lifting her phone from behind the sales counter. "You come into our home and you attempt, for whatever reason, to generate this narrative of me as sad and wretched and somehow both a kept woman and a trollop. And because insinuations aren't enough, you then invent an affair between us, an affair which I had to convince Jane was your creation, just like you somehow took it upon yourself to imply that I was sleeping with all the women we'd had to stay with us. Something that's over, by the way. Of course it's over. A nice, positive thing that's ruined because you decided to write a 200-page fucking hatchet job on us and our lives. Oh, and by the way, the reason that Jane was away, the reason Joshua came to help out, was because she had cancer. Clara is rocking gently, saying, "Oh God, oh God, oh God." She had cancer. She was very, very sick in the end. And because she didn't want it to ruin your last weekend, she asked me to stay with you while Joshua took her for the scan. I didn't know, Clara said. You stupid little girl. Helen stormed from the shop, while Clara gently laid her head face down on the table. Behind the counter, the attendant slowly pressed the red circle to stop recording and crept into the back room.